My wife told me I could either submit completely to her demands or she'd withhold intimacy forever, so I laughed and told her to keep it forever. That wasn't the reaction she expected after years of me eventually caving to her ultimatums. I'm Tyler, 32, work as a network security analyst for a mid-sized tech company in Denver, and I'd been married to Rachel for 6 years when she finally pushed me past my breaking point. Looking back, I should have recognized the pattern much earlier, but when you're living inside a dysfunctional dynamic, it's surprisingly difficult to see the forest for the trees. It started as another argument about household responsibilities in our 3-bedroom suburban Denver home that we'd bought during happier times. Rachel, who worked as a real estate appraisal specialist and prided herself on attention to detail, had this particular way of turning every minor discussion into a major power struggle. She'd escalate seemingly innocent disagreements into full-scale confrontations, then use emotional manipulation and guilt to get her way. This particular Tuesday evening, she was absolutely furious that I'd loaded the dishwasher with the plates facing the wrong direction according to her precise system, which somehow became a comprehensive referendum on my respect for her, our home, and our entire marriage. I tried explaining calmly that clean dishes were ultimately the goal regardless of the specific loading methodology, but Rachel wasn't remotely interested in practical logic or reasonable compromise. The argument spiraled quickly into familiar territory where Rachel methodically listed every perceived slight, minor inconvenience, and behavioral infraction from the past month, building her comprehensive case for why I needed to fundamentally change my approach to everything. She accused me of being deliberately stubborn, chronically inconsiderate, and completely unwilling to meet her halfway, though compromise in Rachel's carefully constructed vocabulary invariably meant doing exactly what she wanted without any discussion, questions, or alternative suggestions. I'd been through this exhausting cycle hundreds of times throughout our marriage, always eventually apologizing for things I didn't think required apologies and adjusting my behavior to keep the fragile peace. Rachel had learned over years of practice that if she escalated the conflict enough, if she made the emotional pain sufficiently intense, I'd eventually surrender completely just to restore some semblance of household harmony. But something was fundamentally different that particular night. Maybe it was the complete absurdity of having a marriage-threatening argument about dishware arrangement methodology, or maybe it was 6 years of accumulated resentment and exhaustion finally reaching some kind of critical mass in my mind. When Rachel delivered her carefully calculated ultimatum about complete submission to her household demands or complete withdrawal of physical intimacy for the foreseeable future, I felt something profound shift inside me. Instead of the expected anxiety, desperate negotiation, or panicked attempts at compromise, I started laughing. Not cruel or mocking laughter, just genuine amusement at the utterly theatrical nature of her threat and the realization that I simply didn't care anymore. Rachel's confident expression changed instantly from manipulative control to genuine confused shock. She'd never encountered this particular response in our entire relationship history. I told her she could absolutely keep her ultimatum forever, then calmly walked to our converted home office and started methodically collecting my laptop, some essential clothes, toiletries, and personal items. Rachel stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, watching me pack with growing alarm and confusion. She kept asking what exactly I was doing, but I honestly didn't feel like explaining or justifying my actions. The fundamental power dynamic that had defined our marriage for years had just shifted permanently and irrevocably, and we both understood it intuitively. I moved into our converted home office that very night, setting up a surprisingly comfortable sleeping area and organized workspace. Rachel alternated between anger and confusion, clearly waiting for me to return to our well-established pattern of conflict, negotiation, and eventual reconciliation. But I was completely done participating in her exhausting emotional games. For the first time in our entire marriage, I'd responded to her manipulation with complete indifference, and it terrified her more than any argument or confrontation ever could. I realized with startling clarity that our marriage had devolved into nothing more than a series of calculated power struggles disguised as normal domestic disagreements, and I was finally ready to stop playing a game I could never actually win. The following weeks became an exercise in complete emotional detachment as I refused to engage with Rachel's increasingly desperate attempts to restore our previous dynamic where she held all the control and I eventually surrendered to maintain peace. Rachel clearly expected me to break within a few days, to come crawling back with apologies and promises to behave according to her precise specifications, but I maintained absolute silence on the subject of our relationship status. She tried every manipulation technique in her well-practiced arsenal, starting with passive-aggressive comments about my supposedly childish behavior, dramatic sighs whenever I entered common areas of our home, and pointed questions about my sudden personality change that she delivered with calculated concern. I responded to her provocations with neutral politeness when absolutely necessary or complete silence when possible, treating her like a roommate I barely knew rather than the wife who had controlled my emotional state for years. My unexpected composure and complete lack of reaction began to genuinely unnerve Rachel in ways I'd never witnessed during our entire relationship. She'd grown accustomed to my predictable responses, my eventual capitulation, my desperate attempts to restore harmony between us. But now she was dealing with someone who simply didn't care about her approval, her anger, or her emotional manipulation tactics. I established a morning routine of leaving for work early to avoid breakfast conversation, returning home to prepare dinner for myself alone, and spending evenings in my office space reading, working on personal projects, or simply enjoying the peace and quiet. Rachel would hover around the edges of my new routine, clearly hoping for some opening to restart our familiar patterns of conflict and resolution, but I gave her absolutely nothing to work with. The physical separation became permanent as I transformed the home office into a genuinely comfortable living space, complete with a quality air mattress that I eventually replaced with a proper daybed, my own coffee maker, and organizational systems for my clothes and personal belongings. Rachel watched these changes with growing alarm, realizing that I wasn't staging some temporary protest or waiting for her to make concessions. I was actually building a separate life within our shared home, creating boundaries that she couldn't cross or manipulate. She'd test these boundaries constantly, entering my space uninvited to ask innocent questions about household logistics, but I'd answer briefly and politely before returning to whatever I was doing, never giving her the emotional engagement she desperately needed to regain control. The most telling aspect of this period was watching Rachel's growing desperation as she realized her traditional methods were completely ineffective for the first time in our relationship history. She'd oscillate between anger at my uncharacteristic behavior and confusion about how to respond to someone who simply refused to participate in emotional drama. I observed her testing different approaches, trying to provoke reactions through criticism, guilt, concern, or even attempts at normal conversation, but I maintained consistent detachment from all of it. She'd complain to her friends on the phone, loud enough for me to hear, about my sudden coldness and strange behavior, clearly hoping I'd overhear and feel compelled to defend myself or explain my actions. Instead, I'd simply put on headphones or leave the room entirely, demonstrating that her opinion of me no longer held any power over my emotional state or daily decisions. With my emotional energy no longer consumed by managing Rachel's moods and demands, I began the most comprehensive personal transformation of my adult life, starting with joining CrossFit Denver, a gym in the downtown area that offered early morning classes perfect for my new routine. I committed to 5:30 workouts that became my daily ritual, arriving home energized and accomplished before Rachel even woke up for work. The physical challenge of weightlifting, metabolic conditioning, and functional movement patterns provided an outlet for years of suppressed frustration while building genuine confidence I'd forgotten I could feel. Within weeks, I noticed changes not just in my physical appearance but in how I carried myself throughout the day, walking taller and speaking with more conviction during work meetings and social interactions. The wardrobe overhaul came next as I systematically replaced years of comfortable but worn clothing with sharp, well-fitted attire that reflected my renewed self-respect and growing confidence. I invested in quality pieces rather than quantity, choosing classic styles that made me feel professional and put together rather than the casual, apologetic appearance I'd maintained throughout my marriage. Rachel watched these changes with increasing anxiety, commenting sarcastically about my sudden interest in fashion and asking pointed questions about who I was trying to impress. I ignored her implications entirely, explaining simply that I enjoyed looking professional and taking care of my appearance, a concept that seemed to genuinely confuse her since she'd grown accustomed to my previous indifference toward my own image. Reconnecting with Marcus, my college friend who worked as a freelance photographer, opened up social opportunities I'd abandoned during my marriage without even realizing it. Marcus invited me to networking events, gallery openings, and casual meetups with his creative friends who were genuinely interesting people with actual passions and goals beyond controlling their partner's behavior. These social interactions reminded me what normal conversations felt like when they weren't loaded with hidden agendas or emotional manipulation tactics. I found myself laughing genuinely for the first time in years, engaging in discussions about technology, photography, travel, and current events without constantly monitoring my words to avoid triggering someone's anger or disapproval. The rock climbing discovery happened almost by accident when Marcus suggested we try the indoor climbing facility near downtown Denver after I mentioned wanting to challenge myself physically beyond the gym routine. The combination of problem-solving, physical strength, and mental focus required for climbing routes appealed to my analytical mind while providing an entirely different type of challenge than my work in network security. I started attending regularly, eventually joining a climbing club that met twice weekly for indoor sessions and monthly outdoor trips to the nearby Rocky Mountain climbing areas. The climbing community was welcoming and supportive, focused on personal improvement and encouraging others rather than competing or tearing people down, which felt revolutionary after years of living with someone who viewed every interaction as a potential power struggle. Rachel observed all these changes with growing alarm and barely concealed panic, realizing that I was systematically building a fulfilling life that didn't revolve around our toxic dynamic or require her approval in any way. She'd make snide comments about my new hobbies, suggesting they were expensive wastes of time or obvious attempts to meet other women, but I'd respond with genuine enthusiasm about my progress and goals, treating her negativity like background noise rather than the devastating criticism it was intended to be. For the first time in our relationship, I was pursuing interests and friendships that brought me joy and satisfaction, creating an identity separate from the role of apologetic husband I'd played for so long. As my transformation became impossible to ignore, Rachel shifted dramatically from indifference to active pursuit, desperately attempting to reclaim the control she'd lost through increasingly obvious and pathetic attempts at seduction and reconciliation that would have worked perfectly in our previous dynamic. She began cooking elaborate dinners that she'd never bothered making during our marriage, preparing my favorite meals and setting the dining table with candles and our good china as if we were celebrating some special occasion. The irony wasn't lost on me that she'd suddenly discovered domestic skills she'd claimed were beneath her for years, but I'd politely thank her for dinner, eat quickly, and return to my office space without engaging in the romantic atmosphere she was desperately trying to create. Her wardrobe choices around the house became progressively more revealing and deliberately provocative, wearing low-cut tops, short skirts, and lingerie she'd let me glimpse accidentally when I passed through common areas of our home. She'd find excuses to touch my arm during conversations, brush against me while reaching for items in the kitchen, or position herself provocatively while doing household tasks she hoped I'd notice and appreciate. These seduction attempts were so transparent and calculated that they felt more like a business presentation than genuine affection, and I'd respond with the same polite disinterest I'd show to an unwanted sales pitch before calmly excusing myself to continue whatever I was actually doing. Rachel started asking about my activities with forced casualness, trying to gather intelligence about my new social life while pretending she wasn't desperately concerned about my growing independence and confidence. She'd inquire about my climbing friends, my workout partners, and particularly about any women in my social circle, fishing for information that might help her strategize her next approach. I'd answer her questions briefly and factually without providing the detailed explanations or reassurances she was clearly seeking, treating these conversations like casual small talk with an acquaintance rather than intimate discussions with my wife. Her desperation reached embarrassing new heights when she began initiating physical contact more aggressively, attempting to kiss me during casual interactions or suggesting we watch movies together on our old couch like we used to do during happier times. I'd gently but firmly redirect these advances, explaining that I wasn't interested in physical intimacy while maintaining my polite demeanor, never giving her the angry rejection she could have used to portray herself as a victim. The frustrated confusion on her face during these interactions was almost comical, as she clearly couldn't understand why her previously effective tactics were meeting with such consistent and calm resistance. The breaking point of her pursuit campaign came when Rachel directly confronted me about our lack of physical relationship, telling me with tears in her eyes that she missed our connection and wanted to rebuild what we'd lost together. I looked at her with genuine puzzlement, asking exactly what connection she was referring to and what specifically she missed about our previous relationship dynamic. When she couldn't articulate anything beyond vague references to closeness and intimacy, I pointed out that our relationship had been defined by conflict, manipulation, and my eventual surrender for years. The look of dawning realization on her face told me she was beginning to understand that I truly no longer wanted what she was offering, and that her window for easy reconciliation had closed permanently while she wasn't paying attention. Rachel's final desperate gambit came on a Sunday morning when she appeared in my office doorway with tears streaming down her face, delivering what she clearly believed would be a decisive emotional appeal that would guilt me back into our previous dynamic through vulnerability and admissions of wrongdoing. She told me through genuine sobs that she'd spent weeks reflecting on our relationship and finally understood how controlling and manipulative she'd been throughout our marriage, acknowledging specific incidents where she'd used emotional manipulation to get her way. She admitted that she'd taken my kindness and patience for granted, treating me like a servant rather than an equal partner, and begged for a chance to rebuild our relationship on healthier foundations with mutual respect and genuine compromise. I listened calmly to her entire emotional speech, watching her deploy every manipulation technique that had previously worked to make me feel guilty and responsible for solving our problems, but feeling nothing beyond mild curiosity about whether she actually believed what she was saying. She promised fundamental changes in her behavior, claiming she'd learned to appreciate what she'd had and desperately wanted another chance to be the wife I deserved. She talked about couples therapy, individual counseling, taking a vacation together to reconnect, and establishing new patterns of communication based on equality rather than control. The performance was genuinely impressive, covering every possible angle that might trigger my protective instincts or desire for harmony. When Rachel finished her carefully crafted appeal, I waited several moments before responding, letting the silence stretch until her hopeful expression began to shift toward anxiety and doubt. I told her with complete calm that I appreciated her apparent self-awareness and hoped that she would continue growing as a person, but that I no longer wanted our marriage and saw absolutely no possibility for genuine change in our fundamental dynamic. I explained that her speech, while touching, felt like another manipulation attempt designed to restore her access to the control she'd lost rather than a sincere desire for an equal partnership. Rachel's shock was immediate and complete when she realized that her vulnerability hadn't worked, that my decision wasn't based on anger or hurt feelings she could address, but on a fundamental rejection of our entire relationship structure. She shifted quickly from tears to anger, accusing me of being cold and heartless, claiming I was punishing her for mistakes she was trying to correct. I remained completely composed, explaining that I wasn't punishing anyone, just choosing not to continue a marriage that had made both of us miserable for years. Her desperation reached new heights as she realized that all her traditional methods of influence had become completely powerless. The moment that ended our marriage came when I calmly pulled out my phone and called a divorce attorney I'd researched weeks earlier, scheduling a consultation for the following Tuesday while Rachel stood there in absolute shock and disbelief. I spoke professionally with the attorney's receptionist about scheduling and paperwork, treating the conversation like any other business appointment while Rachel watched her last hope of controlling the situation disappear entirely. When I hung up, she was staring at me with complete devastation, finally understanding that I'd already made my decision and moved far beyond the point where her emotional appeals could influence my thinking. Her breakdown was immediate and complete, but I felt only relief and clarity about ending a marriage that should have concluded years earlier. The divorce proceedings revealed Rachel's true character as she alternated wildly between vengeful attacks and pitiful appeals, hiring an aggressive attorney who specialized in contentious divorces and attempting to claim I'd abandoned our marriage without reasonable cause or proper communication about our problems. She tried portraying herself as the confused victim of my sudden personality change, suggesting I'd become emotionally abusive through my withdrawal and refusal to engage with her attempts at reconciliation. Her lawyer pushed for substantial alimony payments and a larger share of our assets, arguing that Rachel had sacrificed career advancement to support our marriage and deserved compensation for her contributions to our household and relationship. I worked closely with my attorney to document Rachel's extensive history of emotional manipulation, control tactics, and the systematic erosion of our relationship through her refusal to treat me as an equal partner rather than a resource to be managed. We compiled evidence of her patterns of escalation, ultimatums, and emotional abuse, presenting a clear chronological case for irreconcilable differences based on fundamental incompatibility rather than sudden abandonment. Throughout the entire legal process, I maintained the same composed demeanor that had initially shocked Rachel, treating depositions and negotiations as professional obligations rather than emotional battlegrounds where I needed to defend my character or justify my decisions. Rachel's public relations campaign against me became increasingly desperate as she spread carefully crafted stories about my alleged coldness and sudden transformation to our mutual friends, neighbors, and anyone else who would listen to her version of events. She painted herself as the abandoned wife who'd tried everything to save our marriage, while portraying me as someone who'd become inexplicably cruel and withdrawn without warning or explanation. She claimed I'd refused couples therapy, ignored her attempts at compromise, and essentially punished her for minor disagreements by shutting down emotionally and planning a secret divorce behind her back. I chose not to engage in public disputes or defend myself against her narratives, focusing entirely on the legal aspects of our divorce while letting people draw their own conclusions about the truth of our situation. My friends who knew me well weren't surprised by Rachel's behavior and had actually been waiting for me to recognize the toxic dynamics they'd observed for years. New acquaintances from my climbing group and social circles saw me as the calm, reasonable person I'd become rather than the apologetic, anxious version Rachel's manipulation had created, so her stories about my alleged cruelty didn't align with their direct experience of my character. As I packed my belongings to move into a modern loft apartment near downtown Denver's Tech District, Rachel staged one final desperate attempt to guilt me into reconsidering our divorce by accusing me of throwing away years of marriage history without giving therapy or compromise a genuine chance. She claimed I was abandoning not just her but the life we'd built together, the shared memories and experiences that should have meant something to me as her husband. My response was measured and absolutely final as I explained that I wasn't abandoning our marriage but simply refusing to remain imprisoned by a relationship that had become a series of power struggles disguised as normal domestic life. I told her that I'd given our marriage everything I had for 6 years, and I was finally choosing my own well-being over maintaining the illusion that we could somehow transform our fundamental incompatibility into a healthy partnership through sheer determination and endless compromise on my part. 6 months after my divorce was finalized, I was thriving in my new life with an energy and contentment I'd forgotten was possible during my marriage, living in a sleek downtown loft with exposed brick walls and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked Denver's bustling tech district. The location was perfect for my lifestyle, allowing me to walk to work at my network security firm and easily access the city's vibrant social scene, restaurants, and cultural events I'd avoided for years while managing Rachel's moods and demands. My living space reflected my newfound appreciation for quality and personal taste, furnished with carefully chosen pieces that made me feel comfortable and proud of my environment rather than constantly apologetic for taking up space. My fitness journey had evolved into serious athletic pursuits as I continued competing in local rock climbing competitions throughout Colorado, developing genuine expertise that earned respect from fellow climbers and building a close-knit community of outdoor enthusiasts who shared my passion for challenge and adventure. The physical confidence I'd gained translated into every aspect of my life, from work presentations where I spoke with authority and conviction to social situations where I felt completely comfortable being myself without constantly monitoring others' reactions. Weekend climbing trips to the Rocky Mountains became regular adventures with friends who genuinely enjoyed my company rather than tolerating my presence or expecting me to fund their activities. Dating Jessica, a talented graphic designer I'd met through Marcus's creative network, represented everything healthy relationships could offer when both people brought their whole selves to the partnership without hidden agendas or manipulation tactics. Jessica appreciated my thoughtful nature and analytical mind, finding my work in cybersecurity fascinating rather than boring, and she shared stories about her own creative projects with genuine enthusiasm rather than expecting me to solve her problems or fund her dreams. We approached our relationship with the hard-earned wisdom of recognizing healthy dynamics and maintaining individual independence, supporting each other's goals without losing ourselves in codependency or control struggles. Through mutual acquaintances and Denver's surprisingly small professional network, I learned that Rachel had struggled significantly after our divorce, attempting to date but finding herself unable to maintain relationships once her controlling tendencies and financial expectations became apparent to potential partners. Her real estate appraisal career had stagnated without the emotional support system I'd unknowingly provided, and she'd moved back in with her parents temporarily while trying to rebuild both her professional and personal life. Several friends mentioned seeing her at social events looking isolated and overwhelmed, clearly having difficulty adjusting to independence and self-reliance after years of having someone else manage the practical and emotional aspects of daily life. I felt no satisfaction or vindication in learning about Rachel's difficulties, only profound gratitude for my own freedom and the realization that walking away from toxicity had been the best decision of my adult life. The contrast between my current contentment and my previous constant anxiety was so stark that I sometimes couldn't believe I'd tolerated that level of stress and manipulation for so long. My new relationships, both romantic and platonic, were based on mutual respect, genuine affection, and shared interests rather than obligation, guilt, or financial dependency. When I looked back at my marriage, I felt like I was remembering someone else's life, grateful for the lessons learned but absolutely certain that I'd chosen the right path toward authentic happiness and partnership with someone who actually wanted to build something beautiful together rather than simply extracting value from my presence.